Got a bit of a sore throat, so I hope I don't have a problem projecting or what have you. It's nice to see so many familiar faces. One never knows whether to be flattered or whether to duck behind the desk. There's so many. Thanks for the introduction. And in the introduction, it was mentioned that my first visit to Arabia was as assistant to the archaeological advisor in the Ministry of Heritage and Culture in Oman. And the advisor at that time, of course, was Paulo Costa. And I was very sad to be informed earlier this year that he died around about Christmas of this year. It wasn't always easy working with Paulo over a period of about 2 years, but it was on the whole very informative and enjoyable. The last time I saw him was in Aden in 2008 when he turned up at a meeting we were having, and he was particularly happy because his book on the shrines and mosques of Oman had just been translated into Arabic and made required reading in the schools in the Sultanate of Oman. Prior to that, I think the last time I heard Paulo speak was in the mid-1990s. I was asked to organise a lecture. I think it was for the seminar for the Society for Arabian Studies, because he was visiting Britain, and he actually gave a talk on the Periplus of the Eritrean Sea. I quite enjoyed it myself, and the next morning I had a knock on the door of the office I had at the Institute, and there was the head of Greek and Roman archaeology standing there, and he said in a very effuse manner, Carl, that lecture last night, I hadn't enjoyed a lecture so much for years. I thoroughly enjoyed it. So I thought, good, it was worth the effort. Later that day I had a knock on the door. Someone came in. It was the head of the prehistory department at that time. He said, Carl, that lecture last night. I said, yes. He said, it's the worst lecture I've ever been to. So from that I take it, you can't always please everybody. The talk that I want to give tonight is on the Periplus, South Arabian, far side ports, and it's very much structured in those three parts. And what it kind of reflects, and it is very much work in progress. It's trying to combine a number of things that I'm interested in. Primarily, I'm an archaeologist. I have been involved in many archaeological projects, and that is my métier. But I have other interests as well, including the British legacy, particularly in the area of the Gulf of Aden, on both sides of the Gulf of Aden, on the Iranian side and on the African side. And I'm particularly interested, and have been for a number of years, interested in the exploration of that part of both Arabia and East Africa. So what I'm trying to do is bring some of the threads, or present some of the threads of that research. It might not be in the most coherent of ways, but let's see. And I want to start off with the Periplus. I should say that each of these sections, there might be information that some of you are very familiar with, whereas other sections, hopefully, you won't be as familiar with. So, the Periplus. What is the Periplus? I'm so glad to hear someone say that. The Periplus is a document here written in Greek, originally in the 1st century AD, middle of the 1st century AD. The only extant copy, or one of two extant copies, the main one, is what we see on the right here, which is the Periplus manuscript, which is now in Heidelberg. The Periplus basically describes the trade taking place throughout the Red Sea region, down the coast of Eastern Africa, and alternatively, instead of going down the coast of East Africa, along the southern coast of Arabia and over to India. And it's quite detailed. It's very short. It's only 66 relatively short passages. And it's quite detailed, though, in describing both the ports, places visited, sometimes with information about the political organisation in and surrounding the ports, and mainly listing the commodities that were exchanged, both exported and imported into the various ports. The manuscript in Heidelberg dates from the 10th century, and that is the manuscript that has been mainly used in providing translations and commentaries on the Periplus. There is a second manuscript, which is thought to date from the 15th century, which is in the British Library. It was acquired in the 1850s. But that appears to have been ignored by most people who thought or considered it to be a rather poor copy of the earlier 10th century manuscript. In terms of translations and commentaries, the first was in 1533 by Galenius, published by Galenius. What this is a presentation of his reading of the Greek text and a translation into Latin. His publication of the Periplus, nevertheless, remained the main source for all subsequent translations and commentaries up until the middle of the 19th century. Following Galenius in 1550, the Italian geographer Ramusio translated parts of the Periplus text, based on Galenius, into Italian. And in 1577, a further presentation of the text based on Galenius was done by Stuckius in 1577. It's his edition of the Periplus, which then provided the raw materials for the next couple of hundred years. In 1683, Blancardi provided also a further copy of the text and commentary based, as he states, very much on the work of Stuckius. Blancardi, however, included in his volume of texts both the Periplus and other texts which were attributed to Arrian, and therefore mistakenly the Periplus was considered for a long time to be the work of Arrian also. But Blancardi included this map, which you can see here, the Erythraean Sea, and shown on the map are the suggested locations of some of the places mentioned in the Periplus. But one has to note that the map that he's using is by Ortelius. This is already 100 years old when Blancardi annotated it, or when Blancardi's publisher annotated it with the material from the Periplus. And you can see that although we can readily recognize, Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula here, for example, the island of Socotra doesn't exist. The place identified with Socotra in the Periplus is way up here. Looks more like a representation of Nazira Island rather than Socotra. And other places are very inaccurately shown. In the 17th century, the latter part of the 17th century, Johann Hudson in Oxford also provided a Latin translation of the Greek text of the Periplus based on Stuckius. Now, you've hopefully already worked out why I've been using John Varley's very nice painting of Tots Hill in London, looking across at Westminster Abbey, and that is because, obviously, you know this, today, if we look from the same more or less point of view, we are in Vincent Square, and Vincent Square is named after William Vincent, the Dean in the 1802 through to 1815, the Dean of Westminster. Tots Hill, which is in the foreground of Varley's painting here, this is where he established the playing fields for Westminster School. but Vincent was also a classicist. And it's Vincent in the end of the 18th century, first published The Voyage of Nearchus, which he considered the first sort of really great achievement of European navigation in the Indian Ocean area. And in 1800 and 1805, he provided a commentary on the Periplus. The first volume considers the Red Sea and Africa, the second part Arabia and India. Very often one sees this referred to in bibliographies as being Vincent's translation of the Periplus. It wasn't a translation at all, it was a commentary on the Periplus. That said, very extensive commentary, and in 1807 both The Voyage of Nearchus and the Periplus were published in 2 volumes under the title of The Commerce and Navigation of the Ancients in the Indian Ocean. In response to that, there was quite a demand for an actual translation of the Periplus. And in 1809, the Oxford University Press, as it was then, published Vincent's translation from Greek into English of both Nearchus and Periplus of the Eritrean Sea. So, by the early part of the 19th century, we have the first English translation available of the Periplus. One thing which occurred to me was how did this early tradition, based mainly on Galenius, the works of Galenius, Stuckius, Vincent for his translation used Blancardi, for example, where have we got to since then? And since then there's been another sort of, what I would say, intermediate tradition, and that was starting in 1855 when Müller again got access to the original manuscript. So at this point now we're back to working on the original manuscript, not on the earlier copies of the manuscript. And Müller's text was used very much by the other 2 authors of English editions of the Periplus. 1879, McCrindle's Commerce and Navigation of the Eritrean Sea, the title, very much, as you can see, borrowed from Vincent's Commerce and Navigation of the Ancients. And although McCrindle says that he was using Müller's text, it's very clear that he was also lending very, very heavily on Vincent's English translation. And similarly, Schoff, the Periplus of the Eritrean Sea, in 1912, uses also information from all previous editions, including Vincent's translation. There was then another sort of interval until, that should be, 1927, not 1827, when the Swedish author Hilmar Frisk, again working on the actual manuscript, published his Peripl of the Eritrean Sea. And this provides a copy of the Greek text and a very detailed analysis of the grammar, the syntax and everything used in it. And that tends to be the edition that people use now for looking at the language of the Periplus. That was used by Lionel Casson, who in 1809 published his Periplus of the Maris Eritrea, the Eritrean Sea, which also provides a commentary bringing up to date a lot of the work that's been done within the region. I think it's safe to say that Casson's text is the one that we mainly use now when we want to refer to the Periplus. All of these authors, inevitably, Casson is critical of Frisk, Schoff is critical of McCrindle, McCrindle is critical of Müller. We know how it works, sort of thing. So, as someone who can't read the Greek at all, I wondered just how competent would someone like Vincent, for example, have been at the end of the 18th century when translating a text such as the Periplus. So I don't know if this is a valid form of textual analysis, but what I did, both for interest, basically, is to compile pages of this, which is Vincent's text on the left and the Casson, the most recent Casson text in English on the right there. And the first thing that becomes quite apparent, and I don't know how significant this is that the more modern translation is much more concise than the earlier one. However, when you look at the content, there's barely any difference, actually. Especially in terms of the descriptions of where the ports were located, the topographical features are almost identical, both in Vincent's translation and in the translation provided by Casson. Where there are differences is when it comes on the specific names of imported and exported items. So, anyone on board a ship with Vincent available to them, I think wouldn't be at any great disadvantage when trying to locate ports mentioned in the Periplus. Vincent was fortunate at the end of the 18th century, I got it right, at the end of the 18th century, there was a dramatic improvement in the charting of particularly the eastern seas, the Indian Ocean, for example. This is the French map by de Mannevillette, which, as you can see, is far more accurate than the map of Ortelius that Blancardi had access to. And also, this is at a time when it was quite crucial, the mapping of the ports in the Indian Ocean region, to facilitate the commerce, the modern time commerce that was now taking place between, for example, Britain and India. And hence, the charting of the Western Indian Ocean was seen as a matter of importance, and this resulted in the maps which still form the basis for many of the navigational charts today. The maps compiled by the Indian Navy, particularly the survey work done by Captain Haynes on board the survey rig, the Palinurus. And here's a picture of Captain Haynes, the one who acquired Aden. And although not in the southern coast of Arabia, this is the only picture I know of the Palinurus, the survey rig that they were all aboard. Haynes had a number of very, very capable people amongst his crew. Probably the best known is James Wellstead, known because of the publications of his books on Arabia and particularly Oman and Socotra. And as he says here, he draws attention to the fact that basically prior to their doing their survey work, this region was better known in detail by the ancient authors rather than how it was known by the modern authors. But as part of the survey, the surveying and mapping of the coasts, Sir Charles Malcolm in Bombay had really given impetus for the personnel of the Indian Navy to do whatever they could to gather information of all sorts. So whether it be flora, fauna, geology, and whatever, and also, though it's never specified, archaeology. The two main sites in the Periplus that are mentioned, or the two first sites in South Arabia that are mentioned, are Musa and Okelis. Both of these are at the southern end of the Red Sea. And I'm going to skate over them very, very quickly, because basically the identification between Musa, which is described as a very bustling Arab seaport, is usually identified with the same location of modern-day Mocha. That said, there is hardly any archaeological evidence to date which can be related or relate Mocha to the time of the Periplus. And likewise, Okelis, south of Musa, near the Straits of the Bab el-Mandeb is another site which one has not yet been able to point to actual on-the-ground evidence and say this is the location of the site. Aden is mentioned in the Periplus, but it's mentioned as having earlier been destroyed. So it didn't have the importance that it is probably previously had. But then, what it says in the Periplus is that immediately after Udaymon Arabia, that's Aden, comes along coast and bay, populated by the villages of nomads and Mikliafaji, that stretch for 2,000 stades or more, at which point, beyond the projecting headland, is another port of trade on the coast, Cannae, belonging to the kingdom of Eliazos, the frankincense-bearing land. So here we've got the reference to what the South Arabian king, and you can see also here there's this importance of frankincense beginning to creep in as well. Vincent located Cannae as being more or less in the vicinity of Muqalla. In actual fact, we can show you now that it became quickly apparent in the early 19th century that Cannae is a slight distance to the west of Cannae in the vicinity of Bir Ali. This is a Google image of Bir Ali from a few years ago. This bay, which you can imagine being a very attractive harbour. This curious feature over here, this volcano thing. So, having been encouraged by Charles Malcolm and Captain Haynes to go ashore and explore and find all kinds of things that are interesting, you can imagine that this feature here would have been of interest. And here's the drawing of it, done sometime around about 1834 by a member of Haynes's crew. I suspect it was probably by Charles Cruttenden. As I say, he had some very able people aboard, mainly Cruttenden, Hulton and Wellstead, all of whom had rather unfortunate lives, as it happens. But I particularly like this drawing, which is included in Haynes's unpublished report. And I like to think that these people who are otherwise anonymous, Hulton, Wellstead and Cruttenden, that one or two of these characters here might be them. I also like the depiction of the small badlow down here, which accompanied the Palinurus and enabled them to get close in shore. In addition to this feature over here, there's another conspicuous landmark here at Bir Ali, there, and that is the, as described here, the Black Mountain of Husn al-Khurab. This again is a drawing from 1834, and this is how it looks on the ground. In May of 1834, Jessup Hulton and two other members of the crew of the Palinurus went ashore here, and from the summit of this mountain we'll have seen that it was surrounded by an ancient site. There is also a rather precarious path which leads from the beach up to the top of the Husn al-Khurab. Here it is, it's had a little bit of restoration there, and as one approaches the summit, one sees this inscription. Now, I know you probably can't make it out. You have to be up close to see it, because it's a very lengthy inscription, today known as CIH 641. It's very difficult to get a good photo of it, because if you step back, you very quickly find yourself in a precarious position. But these people, Haynes, Hulton and that, they were all very good draftspersons. They'd obviously had training. We've seen some of their sketches on spot sketches. And also, they were able to copy in detail inscriptions such as the one that we've seen here. It would have been quite precarious for them, climbing up, and they would have needed a ladder of some sort to do this. But basically, this is the first copy of the inscription that was made by, probably initially by Holton, Joseph Holton, but published subsequently in the Journal of the Royal Geographical Society by James Wellsted. Unfortunately, this doesn't date to the time of the Periplus. It dates to the 6th century AD. That said, because of the, and one has to remember, they weren't able to read this. No one could read it at this point. This is a very, very fundamentally important discovery and publication. It was on the basis of this that in 1844, the German Orientalists, Pisanius and Rogier, were able to offer the first translations of ancient South Arabia. It's a pity they couldn't read it, because this small inscription, which is on the summit here at the beginning, has the name Cana. So they would have known exactly where they were. Irrespective of that, Joseph Holton, who was the doctor on board the Palinurus, wrote in his diary, "In an antiquarian point of view, I consider this discovery as highly interesting. The great care that has been taken to add to the natural strength of the rock shows that it's meant to be a defense of some place of consequence. And in my own mind, I have settled the question, for without any doubt, Shade and Vincent rest in peace." And I think reading his diary, it becomes clear that on board the ship, they actually had a copy of Vincent, both the commentary and possibly the translation. And he says, "This, and not Makala Bay, is the site of ancient Cana. I confess that I hesitate to differ with the learned doctor, whose talents and intimate acquaintance with the subject entitle him to the highest deference. But I think the evidence is quite irresistible." So I think this is a very nice example of how suddenly we get this exploration taking place. Exploration largely as a result of commerce between, the Britain and India, and tied in with this, we get this exploration, this detailed mapping of that, but also still an interest in the classics, what they can learn from them, but also feeding back details that enable us to get a better impression of the text, such as the Periplus. In the Periplus after Cana, the next place that is mentioned, and mentioned as being part of the kingdom of South Arabia, part of the same kingdom as the kingdom of Aliazos, who had of which Cana was a part of the kingdom. They also mentioned the island of Dioscorida, which is of course Socotra. And Socotra was being considered alongside Aden as a potential coaling station at this time. And so it was important for the Palinurus to visit and start to map and make detailed descriptions of the island of Socotra. Here's a picture of daily life from Wellsted's publication. The only archaeological discovery that can be attributed to them at this time is at the site of Eriosh, which is to the west of Hadabru, near the modern-day airport, if any of you know it. And here on this flat surface, there are numerous inscriptions, not strictly speaking in South Arabian, but inscriptions and pictograms of various sorts. And because of this, the interest given to recording inscriptions, fulfilling the task that even Niebuhr hadn't been able to do, of recording the so-called Himyarite inscriptions, and that they went some time also to some trouble also to record these ones in Socotra. And I think that basically, apart from work in Sinai, I think that this could basically be said to be the first rock art ever to be recorded in the Arabian Peninsula. Okay, I know it's in the island, but in Arabia. And again, here we see Holton's drawings of the engravings at Arioch. Here's a slightly later one in 1835 by someone named Walpole. I don't know which ship he was on. He wasn't on the Palinurus. But again, you see the same inscription being copied here. And these inscriptions have continued to be copied right up until the present. It seems that every other year someone rediscovers Arioch, what have you. And actually, if you compare the drawings both from, for example, Holton through to the drawings done by Brian Lowe, they're remarkably similar. They're very good representations. Unfortunately, we can't relate them directly to the Periplus, but I would hazard a suggestion, which I'm not hesitant to say because Michael MacDonald is sitting on the front row here, but I think that those inscriptions now we can compare with similar inscriptions known from the area of Dhofar and possibly relating to the general period of the Periplus. Some of you will also be aware how more recently there have been more discoveries both of monumental South Arabian graffiti, Tamil inscriptions, and even Palmyrene inscriptions in the Hoch cave on the northern coast of Socotra. Again, very interesting, but later than the period of the Periplus. Actual substantial remains dating from the period of the Periplus have yet to be verified. Returning to the Periplus and the South Arabian coast, in the Periplus you can see that it says that immediately after Siagros, here at Cape Fartak, there is a bay indenting deeply into the coast. After it, high mountains, rocky and sheer, where men live in caves. And after these, a designated harbour for loading the saccharide frankincense called Moscow Harbour. That is, the site is called Moscow Harbour. Siagros, Vincent guessed that it would be at Cape Fartak here, but we had no evidence to verify that until basically about 10 or 20 years ago. The French mission working in Yemen did find some remains at Cape Fartak, which can be related to the period of the Periplus. But more dramatic in many ways is the site of Moscow, further to the east there, in Dhofar. Moscow is shown to be an important place for the collection of frankincense and its shipping then from Moscow to Cannes and then up probably through the Wadi Mefat to Shabwa, the capital of the Kingdom of Hadramaut. In order to put Moscow accurately on the map, we have to wait until a little bit later in the 1890s, towards the end of the 19th century, when this site was visited by Theodore and Mabel Bent. One of the things that attracted their attention was the abyss here, or what they identified as the abyss, as mentioned by Ptolemy. And here's their map of it here, coming down to the coast, and then down here you see ruins marked, and those ruins are the ruins known today as Khorori. And here we are looking at the excavated, inside the excavated part of the ancient site, looking back towards Darbat Falls, which might be the abyss, Phillips. I just mentioned that the first time I ever visited here was in 1980 with Paulo Costa. But the site has been very much transformed in the last 20 or so years due to the excavations carried out by the University of Pisa at the site of Korori. There are monumental inscriptions as one enters the site. Here's one of them here. There is mention of the same king, Eliasos. There is also a mention of the name of the site, which is Samhurvan. There is no mention in any of the inscriptions found there so far of Moscow as a name. So there are some people who would still say that it's not definite that this is Moscow. And like Vincent, would wish for Moscow to be looked for to the west of Salala, if you can imagine where I mean, going towards Ras-Savir. And that I've done a survey in that area myself, as did Paulo Costa, how it happens. There's nothing dating to the period of the Periplus in that region. I think there's clearly a mistake in the distance recorded in the Periplus, in the original text, of the distance between Siagros and Moscow. Because the finds from Korori or ancient Sumeran very clearly show that this was a major site, the eastern part, if you like, in the eastern part of the kingdom of Hadramaut. Here's a reconstruction of the site, how it looks now. It's been more excavated now, and you can fill in all these spaces here with these storerooms for frankincense and what have you. This is just a photo of one of the intramuros buildings, possibly an intramuros temple. And some of the finds that have come from here, which you can see are just so classically South Arabian. This is clearly part of the South Arabian realm. Another interesting thing at Korori is that the excavations have shown that the finds there, the occupation of the site, is not confined to the 1st century AD. So in other words, the Periplus is only providing us with a snapshot in time. It doesn't mean necessarily that sites mentioned in the Periplus didn't exist before or after the 1st centuries AD. And at the moment, the thinking is that the site at Korori was possibly established as early as the 3rd century BC. This is slightly debatable. Maybe the 2nd century would be a safer bet. But very clearly, in the 1st century AD, was fully occupied with the monumental inscriptions mentioning the same kings as mentioned in Periplus and linking it with Cana. And the commodity, amongst many commodities, that was of importance was frankincense, which is found in this area over here. Now, also, it's important to add that both at Cana and at Korori, amongst the pottery, the imported pottery, both from the Mediterranean and further east from India and also from the Northern Gulf region, accounts for the majority of the pottery found there. So it's good testimony to what we're told in the text of the Periplus. There is a slight tendency, I think, for the whole history of early Arabia to focus perhaps too strongly on incense and the incense trade. And I want to move now from South Arabia over to the far side ports. And what happened in far side ports, which are over here along the northern coast of Somalia, it is clear from the Periplus that this is as important an area for providing aromatics such as frankincense, myrrh, and others that we can't yet identify. And the other, what I think is comes out from Periplus also, is that these ports over here tended to be visited more frequently, both by the Roman fleet coming down here, but from Mocha, Musa, and Okales over in the southern corner of Arabia here. Perhaps not so much as these ports over there, which were much more connected to the Hadramaut rather than the Himyarite kingdom over in the southwest here. So back to this map of the Man of Villette in the end of the 18th century. Just to locate you, this is Berbera here, which is usually identified with the site known as Malao, mentioned in the Periplus. And in the Periplus, it says, from Malao, usually identified as Berbera, but there's no archaeological evidence to confirm that yet. It is 2 runs, that is 2 days, to the port of trade of Mundu, where vessels moor fairly safely at the island that lies very near the shore. This place offers a market for the aforementioned, and similarly, from it is exported the aforementioned merchandise, plus the incense called makrotu, whatever makrotu might be. And here are the various things that are imported and exported from Mundu. And you can see that it's mainly luxury goods that are imported there, and perhaps plant-based materials that are exported from there. Now, we've seen, I hope, from South Arabia, something of the nature of those sites, the sites of Cana and Khorrori, and they're quite substantial settlements. Monumental buildings, monumental inscriptions, lots of imported goods, of course, but basically all affiliated to the kingdom of Hadramaut in the case of Cana and Moscow, Sumeran. What I want to do now is show, like all archaeologists, it's always nice to show some of your more recent activities. So what I want to do now is show the results from a bit of a survey on the northern coast of Somaliland, which is in the location of the place which myself and others, I think, would identify with this site of Mundu. I should mention that whilst the British were very active exploring the southern coast of Arabia in the 19th century, the French were quite active on the coasts of East Africa.